Hello and welcome to our Lunar Reflections podcast, where we'll be journeying with the moon while Jupiter is in Cancer. Each month, we'll release an episode to coincide with the new moon, starting with the beautiful new moon in Cancer, June 25th. My name's Taurus Stevenson, and I'm a British astrologer. This is my first time hosting a podcast, and I'm also recently late diagnosed autistic and ADHD. I'm a Leo Sun, Sagittarius Moon, Leo Rising, and I've been studying astrology for the last 7 years. I practice the tropical whole sign system, and while I predominantly use traditional techniques, I will often sprinkle modern concepts where it resonates. I'm a scientist by background with a degree in genetics and a master's in forensic science, so the dynamics of family astrology particularly fascinates me. So, in terms of the idea for this podcast, I thought it would just be really nice to celebrate Jupiter moving into Cancer where it's exalted. It's a great way to journey alongside both the transit, which lasts 1 year, and also the moon, which is its ruler. I also wanted to create a safe space and refuge from the collective grief we're all feeling in these modern, highly capitalistic times, to try and remind ourselves about the power of hope and quiet internal reflection that the lunar energy can often provide. We all want to feel like we belong, and that begins with nurturing ourselves and others. I decided to invite my good friend Helen to join as a co-host, and we met a few years ago on Astro Twitter, and we've had some really deeply thought-provoking Astro chats. Hi Helen, do you want to introduce yourself and say a bit more about you?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tara. I'm Helen. I'm also known as Heliodora, and I am a student astrologer from Scotland in the UK. I use a mix of Hellenistic, psychological, and some evolutionary elements to my approach, and my astrology is grounded in the tropical zodiac and use whole sign houses. I was in a former life an archaeologist, and that comes into my work. I think there's a kind of historical and philosophical element to the way that I approach my astrology. And I'm also currently training in Reiki, counseling, coaching, and tarot. So, Tara, you mentioned about the transit Jupiter in Cancer that's happening. Do you want to say a wee bit about how that's affecting your chart and what your general thoughts are about Jupiter in Cancer?
Yeah, sure. So we're actually recording this episode on the full moon in Sagittarius, which we didn't actually plan this way, but sometimes that's the way astrology works. I've been actually having quite a few spiritual downloads, and I feel that this full moon in Sagittarius is actually giving us a greater understanding of this mutual relationship with Jupiter in Cancer. So, for those of you who are new to astrology, mutual reception is simply a switch of energy between the two planets. So, Sagittarius is naturally ruled by Jupiter, and Cancer is naturally ruled by the moon. So, they've essentially switched over, and it can be very supportive. So, while Sagittarius and Cancer don't actually see each other on the natal chart because they're in conjunct, they do have this beautiful understanding between each other. So I have a natal Sagittarius moon. So I'm actually looking forward to having this mutual reception show up in my lunar return charts. And there's also mutual reception with Pisces moons. And on top of that, there'll be a supporting water trine. So again, I'm really looking forward to both of those this transit. So personally for me, I have Cancer ruling my 12th house. And so Jupiter there for me, I feel will definitely heighten my spiritual awareness and deepen that, especially on an internal level. We've all had quite a difficult Cancer Mars transit that happened recently. And so I think it'd be quite interesting to look at the themes that kind of Mars threw up for us in our Cancer house and see how Jupiter comes in and gives that kind of optimism and kind of way to move forward. I already think I've got an idea of what kind of themes are going to throw up for me, especially. And I think it'll be around the mother wound. As both a daughter and a mother, I think I'll experience lessons on both levels. And although Jupiter obviously is a greater benefic, we need to remember that there's balance and that there might also be challenges with this transit. And so that will be interesting. And also, I've been thinking about on a mundane level, we've got Saturn that's recently moved into Aries. So there's this square between Saturn and Jupiter. And I think it will kind of heighten our awareness on a societal level, especially after the opposition in 2020. It's almost like 5 years post pandemic. Where are we now? Those are the questions that I feel we're asking as a collective. And you've got this Saturn in Aries, which is in forward, and then you've got this exaltation in Jupiter. So it'll be really kind of interesting and intriguing to see how that kind of works out, especially in our Aries and Cancer houses linked to our sense of purpose. So, what about you? Where's this transit happening for you?
Yeah, so it's angular for me, and I think I didn't mention I'm a Capricorn rising, so that means that it's been my seventh house of relationships where, going back to the first contrast you mentioned with Mars in detriment, having been in the Cancer regions of our charts for what seemed like a really long time last year into this year. So for me, it showed up quite significantly in that regard, kind of drawing things to the surface around how I relate with other people. Jupiter, I felt the shift the night before last when it moved into Cancer, even late in the evening. I could actually feel the vibe shift. So I'm hopeful that it's going to bring a kind of continuation of what that story was about for me. It will also trine my Moon in Scorpio, which we'll talk about a bit later on. And I think as well, just to add, because you also pointed out that contrast with Saturn and fall that we're all experiencing, both on a mundane level and personally. And so that's in my fourth house of home and family. So there's that kind of dynamic tension between Saturn and Jupiter in the early degrees of Cancer as well. So I'm broadly optimistic. I share your feeling that it's not the only thing going on in the sky, but it's going to be a kind of respite for a period of time and a space where some positive, constructive work will be happening. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's also just a perfect time to really focus on lunar topics because using the technique of perfection, which for anyone who's not familiar, it's a technique where you effectively each year at the solar return lights up a different section of the charts, beginning with the ascendant, and every 12 years coming back around the whole zodiac. So for perfecting from the ascendant, I'm in a seventh house Cancer moon ruled year. So I think there's an interplay between that and Jupiter actually being in that sector of my chart this year.
Wow, yeah, that definitely sounds very meaningful and significant, and I'll be interested to like journey alongside with you to see how that kind of plays out because quite often there'll be some kind of hidden surprises as we go along.
Mhm.
I think you're right in terms of we've had a really difficult year astrologically, specifically March was difficult, and so I think this respite is very much needed on a personal and collective level. So super excited for that. So maybe we should talk a little bit about moon significations, and let's just start with the basics in terms of what the moon signifies. So we know that the moon, alongside the sun and the rising, is considered very much focal points for the natal chart, and the moon is very much around our emotions and our feelings, but much deeper than that, it focuses on what makes us feel safe, our sense of belonging, our bodies. It also can represent mother or a mother figure. And it's also linked to our daily comforts and our nourishment. And Bowlby's attachment theory talks about how we're biologically predisposed to form these strong attachments to our caregivers for healthy social and emotional functioning. And I feel that these early attachments influence how we perceive ourselves and therefore others and our relationships. So the moon is very important and it also finds its joy in the third house, which again connects it back to our early childhood and our daily comforts. And I think for anyone listening who's been interested in astrology but felt maybe it's a bit too overwhelming because it there is a lot to learn. Journeying with the moon is for me one of the most easiest and simplest ways to get into the cycles.
Exactly. And I think that you really bring out that link with the past there that the moon has, both, the third house, as you mentioned, early experiences of nurture and comfort. And there is that sometimes nostalgia associated with the moon for that reason and with the sign of Cancer. So I wonder if that's almost something that we might see showing up in both the collective cultural level, but maybe individually for some of us. And I love that connection with nurture and attachment that you brought out, where, yes, it's infancy, but it's also something that we carry with us for all of our lives. And the other key word I was thinking of when you were speaking is home, and that sense of being at home and the love of home and the safety and security of home. And in a way, that's extra fitting because the moon rules the sign of Cancer as its domicile ruler, which kind of means that The moon feels at home when it's in Cancer. So it might be useful just to add a little bit about essential dignities in general in relation to the moon for anyone who's not familiar with that terminology. The moon rules Cancer as its domicile sign or home sign, but it's said to be in detriment in its opposite sign of Capricorn because that's more of a Saturnian environment. It's almost the opposite. It's emotionally, it feels a little bit colder by comparison, a bit lonelier, whereas home, Capricorn's a bit more like being in exile. It's kind of a harder experience of things. We call that being in detriment. And then we say that the moon is exalted in Taurus, which is an earth sign, as you know. And it means that the moon has its exaltation rulership in Taurus, which is a kind of earth sign. The moon feels also very comfortable there because it's sensual, it's grounded, it's very comfortable for the moon. And by contrast, then we have this opposite sign of Scorpio, where the moon is said to be in its fall, and that's an uncomfortable place emotionally for the moon because it has to deal with a lot of deep emotions. We've also mentioned about Jupiter in Cancer as well, because that's the exaltation ruler, whereas Jupiter also rules Sagittarius and Pisces by domicile, and we'll see those connections come up. I think very much that was coming through in what you were saying earlier about when we're having Sagittarius moons and those moons are ruled by Jupiter from Cancer. We're seeing the interconnection of those signs.
Yeah, no, you've made some really good points there. And I think the essential dignities is a great way to really understand the nature of the planet because it talks very much about why it excels in certain signs and why it might feel more difficult in other signs. And actually, you have a Scorpio moon, so it would be great to just hear a little bit about like your lived experience.
Thanks. Yeah, I have that fallen moon in my chart. So, in terms of how I experience that, there's a kind of general level of it, and then obviously it shows up a bit differently in every individual person's chart. One of the key words associated with Moon and Scorpio is intensity, and I think I would resonate with that. I feel things very strongly and deeply, both emotionally and physically. And as you mentioned earlier, the moon is kind of both. It's our body and our emotion, it's our embodied emotion. So it adds up to a kind of sensitivity for me. And another key word is depth that I would relate to. And I think that's one where down the years I've had pretty consistent feedback from people saying, Helen, you can manage to deepen just about any conversation. And it's that tendency to want to go beneath the surface, not being satisfied with anything really superficial. But I would say that opposition with Taurus comes through a bit as well because my Venus is there and it's a night chart, so it's quite a strong Venus. And there's that push and pull between the two where the Scorpio is quite self protective, it's quite wary. It remembers every time that I've ever been hurt and it looks out in the environment for threats. But it's a bit counterbalanced by the Venus in Taurus, which can be a little bit more forgiving, a bit more open, a bit more self expressive, being in the fifth house. And so there's a sort of balancing act there. Thankfully, my whole chart is not just Moon and Scorpio, because that would be quite challenging. I think as well, there's a counterbalance with the ruling sign as well, because my Mars, which rules that Moon and Scorpio, is domiciled in Aries, along with two other personal planets. So while the moon in Scorpio is quite wary and quite cautious about giving away too much about myself, there's always that kind of Aries influence as well, which is quite, why shouldn't I talk about myself? Quite egotistical and quite kind of self-centered in a way. And then the last thing I think that's is a more recent realization about my Scorpio moon is that depth of emotion and those challenging emotional experiences also bring the gift of empathy because it means that when other people are suffering emotionally, you can quite easily understand that. And again, that can counter the self-protectiveness. And I'm thinking about in terms of the contrast with that, Tara, I know your moon is in Sagittarius, which is quite a different experience. I wonder if you'd want to say a wee bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for explaining, how you've experienced Scorpio moon. I can imagine that it can feel quite intense at times, but I do think, yeah, having that supportive Aries Mars probably helps, and there's lots of other stuff in the chart that will help mitigate. So yeah, our moons are very different, but there are some similarities as well, especially when you were talking about, going deep. While the Sagittarius moon might not have the same emotional depth, there's definitely a philosophical depth. And I remember just very early on having these deep questions about the meaning of life and how we ended up here and what else is out there, and looking at the sky and just being quite amazed from such a young age. So I think that Sagittarius energy has given me a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest in the spiritual world. It is in the fifth house, so it's a fun sign in a fun house. So I do like having lots of fun, but also I am very creative. And actually, it's only in later years that I've realized how creative I am because of my moon. And it's something that I definitely want to work on more with intention. It also does, I think it speaks to the bonds that I have with children. I've always naturally resonated with them. And I think that links back to the fact that I was actually a teacher for the early part of my career. And I think that does attribute to that moon in the fifth house. It was funny that you talked about Scorpio moon like scanning for threats, because I think the Sagittarius moon just scans for risks because we're always like taking risks. I'm always, whatever we're not supposed to be doing, I'll be the first one there. I think also being ruled by Jupiter, my moon does mean that I can be quite hedonistic and overindulgent. I think I can sometimes find it hard to stop, and I can sometimes go to excess because of that Jupiter. And I also feel that my Sagittarius moon gives me a lot, like a sense of freedom and independence. Like I need to be able to explore. I need to be able to do what I want within certain constraints, and that lends itself to my interest in travel and different cultures. And I've been really lucky to have traveled quite extensively, both personally and in my and for work. And I think that Sagittarius moon just kind of lends itself to exploring those new ideas as well as new places and people. So yeah, I think our moons are very different, but they in a weird way kind of still speak to each other, because obviously I'm early degree and you're late degree, and so they're probably, I think, 8 degrees between them, so we do have that kind of conjunction out of sign, but it does kind of connect us on a emotional level. And I think that's probably quite nice while we're doing this podcast together.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm a big believer in out of sign conjunctions for this and other reasons, because when you, from experience, you can tell that they really work. And I think the other layer to that is your moon right on my MC, which is we share that love of the philosophical, searching kind of almost intellectually adventurous kind of side of things, which is great. And just when you were talking about freedom and independence there, or that just led me on to thinking about aspects, because I think you have a major aspect that sort of echoes that. So maybe we could both talk about the closest aspects to our moon.
Yeah, sure. So mine is conjunct Uranus, and I would say that I'm emotionally volatile. For those of you who obviously are traditional astrologers, you may not class Uranus as a viable conjunction, but I do feel that both angles and outer planets, if they're aspecting the moon in any way, I do feel that it will have an impact because the moon is so sensitive. I would say that I also have quite a individualistic approach, a little bit. Sometimes I feel like, yeah, I'm a bit like an outsider. I've always felt a little bit different, and I think that effect of the Uranus is part of that. For those of you that follow MBTI types, I'm Inf J, but I'm Inf J turbulent, 83%. And I think that turbulence comes with that Uranus, where it's constantly changing, constantly evolving, and it's on top of my moon as well. And obviously, because moon represents mom, it does actually reflect my mom in a way, because my mom is quite quirky and eccentric. And actually, in terms of modern rulership, it rules Aquarius, and my mom is an Aquarius rising. So I do see that kind of link as well. And Uranus, I'm currently going through my Uranus opposition. It's exact at the moment. So I'm going through my midlife crisis. Yay. And so it has been quite emotionally volatile with my moon being drawn in. Under kind of Hellenistic astrology, my closest aspect would be a sextile to my Jupiter Saturn conjunction Libra. So while that does point to, wisdom, I think it can also point to being a bit preachy at times, because there's this like need to impart all this different information that we kind of take in. And it's interesting that my moon's actually sextiling Jupiter, because that rules my moon. And I do think the Libra energy that pulls in means that I work quite naturally well with others as well. So what about you? What's your closest aspect?
So I have a few, and likewise, it depends if you look at the chart through a kind of more Hellenistic or a more modern psychological lens. But I'll start with angles because it's interesting you mentioned angles in particular, and I think, of course, any planet close to angles is going to show up in a big way in their life. But of course, the moon, which is already highly significant for everyone, definitely seems to have a strong impact when it does so. So my moon has that wide conjunction to the MC that we just talked about in the early degrees of Sagittarius. So I think that's interesting in terms of like my life path and sort of trajectory, and especially kind of later in life, retraining in these areas like astrology and counseling. There's also a really tight sextile to my ascendant and trine to my descendant, which the Scorpio moon rules as well in Cancer. So that's definitely got a really strong bearing on the relationality themes in my life, how I connect with people, generally a preference to connect with people quite deeply, but also to protect myself so that I can do that where it's right. So those themes kind of recur quite a lot. The closest aspects are definitely through a modern lens by degrees because there's a 10-minute to exact conjunction with asteroid Psyche, which I won't get into today because that might be a little bit too tangential for many people. But there's an opposition that's also about a degree from exact with Chiron. And it's interesting when you were talking about Uranus and the kind of individualistic, being perceived as individualistic or an outsider. I think a lot of the outers, when they connect with the moon, give that. And I think there's probably no coincidence in being late diagnosed neurodivergent myself. So the Chiron and Psyche, I would perceive them as adding and intensifying those significations about depth and intensity that I mentioned earlier. But then, if you look at the chart through a Hellenistic lens, you don't have any outer planets, and you're also allowing whole sign aspects. And that's when that opposition with Venus and Taurus comes in, and Venus is about 9 degrees away. So, even in a sign, in a degree based aspect, you probably count that because the moon has you can allow a wide orb for the moon because it moves so quickly. And I mentioned before that's that kind of interplay between the Taurus dimension of being quite kind of grounded and comfortable and loving comfort, and the Scorpio aspect, which craves comfort and security as well, but it also finds it a bit harder to find and get hold of. So there's a definite interplay there between the two of them.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you for explaining like the different aspects that there are. And I think this just kind of reiterates how nuanced the chart is, because for some people their moon might be completely unaspected, which will give a completely different flavor. You seem to have quite a few multiple important aspects, whereas I tend to have kind of one significant one. So it really does depend on the individual chart. So, I mean, we could talk forever about different moon topics, but what's great about this podcast is we can deep dive into so many different topics related to the moon, and we'll aim to cover some of them throughout this series. So, we've mentioned some already, like lunar returns, aspects, there's ways to remediate the moon, especially if you have a difficult moon in a difficult sign or a difficult house. Remediation is where you can intentionally work with the moon or work with a planet to kind of bring out those more positive aspects. There's also void moons. And what's really interesting is the lunation phases. And, I'd love to be able to dive into the work of Dane Rudyard. And he does a lot of really interesting and thought-provoking work around how those different phases really form that real intrinsic part of our personality. But we also have secondary progressions, and I'd love for you to explain a little bit about that, Helen, because we've had some really interesting chats around what our current progressions are, and we've started to kind of track back and look at things that have happened in our lives. And I think that it's a great technique.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of secondary progressions. Ever since I learned about them, they really spoke to me the way I think anyone who's even dabbled in astrology probably has found some methods and techniques just seem to intuitively work. And secondary progression, just to summarize, is a symbolic timing technique. So timing techniques are ways to make the chart, which is kind of a flattened symbol of the entire life of the native captured in the second of birth, and help it to bring to life and into movement and tell us when some of the promise from that chart will actually be realized. So what we do in secondary progression is actually quite simple once you get your head around it. We move the chart symbolically forward 1 year of life for each day of life. So that means that you can effectively look at an ephemeris, which many of us are more accustomed to using chart calculation software these days. But ephemeris is a table that shows the positions of all the planets on a daily basis. So you can look at a page and it will show you and a month or 2 months. And what's great about that is that really the first 3 to 4 months of your life encapsulate your whole progress chart for your whole life. So the moon in that context, when you think about the moon as the fastest moving planet, normally when you're tracking the moon, it's 2.5 days it spends in each sign, and you get a flavour of what that environment is like and how that feels in your chart, picking up your natal planets and so on. But it moves so fast that you can be distracted and miss it. When you're using the secondary progress chart, it will be about 2.5 years where each the moon will be in each sign. So mine, for example, is actually exalted, linking back to the essential dignities chat that we had earlier. So it's been in Taurus, the opposite sign from my natal moon, for a couple of years, and it's now in the very late degrees. It's just come to a new moon. Again, that's talking about phases, which we haven't really got into. And it will be ingressing into Gemini in July. And what we notice when the moon changes sign by progression is just a really big vibe shift. What about yours, Tara?
Yeah, so it's interesting that yours is exalted because mine's in Cancer, so it's in domicile, and we've obviously been called to do this lunar podcast. So I don't think that's not a coincidence. So mine moved from Gemini to Cancer probably last July, and yeah, you're right, it is really loud. I'd had it in the 11th house, and for that 2.5 years, I was just making connections, making new friends. I went to Norwalk. It was just a really vibrant and energetic time. And almost instantaneously, when it moved into Cancer, I just suddenly just needed alone time. I wanted to be at home more. I've become a lot more insular. And I think obviously it's probably linked to my eighth house year that I'm in via annual perfection. But there is a real big shift when that progress moon moves, and if you're not aware of it, you might not exactly know what it is. But I think what's great is you can go back and look at when all those progressions happened and kind of see how they link up to different kind of life events. And one thing I've definitely found with progressions is they seem to be a lot more inherent. It feels like something internal within you rather than a transit, which tends to be external events. So I think that's a really crucial kind of distinction.
That's a really great point. I think, especially with the moon, but also other personal planets, because the progress chart is so unique to you, to the moment of your birth, that it does tend to show up as kind of internal stuff, but there's an interconnection with the outer world as well. And just to share a small anecdote from when my moon was in Aries by progression, just about 3 years ago, it was the first time I bought a new car, and I bought a red car. And I read in this random book about timing techniques that when your progress moon is in Aries, you're more likely to buy a red car. Now that's obviously a very literal way for it to show up because it's being ruled by Mars, and Mars is associated with the color red. But it's just funny because it absolutely showed up that way. And when it moved into Taurus, I really did feel a lot more kind of grounded and a lot less frenetic in my energy, and a lot, I guess I did in a way slow down relative to myself. So it'll be interesting to see when my moon shifts into Gemini by progression. It's pretty much the same day as Uranus ingresses into Gemini. So you can get connections and transits between the progressed planets and the transiting planets and the personal planets, which can make a simple technique kind of as complex as you like once you look at it, but it's always amazing how it shows up.
That's really interesting because I didn't really connect that my progressed Cancer moon then will at some point connect with this Jupiter in Cancer. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of different things that are going on different levels. And just really quickly, this is an aside, but for those of you unaware, there's a real interesting Hellenistic timing technique called zodiacal releasing. And I'm due to have a loosing of the bond, a L2 loosening of the bond in Cancer. So from spirit, by the way. So spirit is connected to not just our career, but more our kind of like life purpose. So I'm again going to be really interested to see how that all kind of plays in. And I think that's what's great about the podcast because we'll be journeying alongside the moon for an entire year. It'll be really interesting to see how things progress from the things that we're talking about today. We're going to have all these different guest astrologers all bringing in their own lived experiences. So thanks so much for agreeing to do this podcast. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Tara. And I think what's lovely about that example is, and as well as the rest of what we've discussed, is it highlights how usually if something's important, it shows up multiple ways in the chart, and you get this interplay between all these different things. So just as you just said, I think that as we journey through the zodiac, as during the course of Jupiter being in Cancer, I think we'll be weaving a tapestry where a few of these different threads will all kind of intersect and come together. So really looking forward to it as well. Thanks very much to everyone who's been listening.
Yeah, no, thanks everyone for listening. And just to let you know, our first episode in the series, we'll be talking with the lovely Nivi about her domicile moon in Cancer. She's also got an exalted Jupiter in Cancer, so that's a great bonus. So we'll release an episode every new moon to talk all things lunar, as well as journeying alongside Jupiter. Thank you for listening to Lunar Reflections and check out our new moon in Cancer episode, which is out June 25th.